Hey, what's up, APUSH kids? We're here for our next lecture in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 7.11, Interwar Foreign Policy. Our learning objective today is objective 7B, one that we've already talked about up to this point, and that's explain the similarities and differences in attitudes about the nation's proper role in the world. Our key idea that we're going to start off with today, key idea 1, says, in the years following World War I, the United States pursued a unilateral foreign policy that used international investment, peace treaties, and select military intervention to promote a vision of international order, even while maintaining U.S. isolationism. Now, after World War I in the 1920s, Americans elected Republican Warren G. Harding, who promised this return to normalcy. He had said America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration. And in this return to normalcy, we were embracing isolationism. And we did so in several ways. We rejected the Treaty of Versailles. We never joined the League of Nations. And this was because many people in the United States felt duped into joining World War I and became even more committed to neutrality. Now, generally speaking, there were two goals of our interwar foreign policy. The number one goal was to maintain an international order through a series of agreements, but a series of agreements that we would control, not one that would be controlled for us through the League of Nations. And secondly, to remain isolated and in control of our own foreign policy. Now, even though we wanted to remain isolated, our isolation was selective. Now, we did still need and want to play a role in world affairs, but we wanted it to be on our terms, really not on anybody else's. Now, a few examples of this included when we hosted the Washington Naval Conference. Now, the idea behind this was to reduce the military strength of really all nations around the world. This set tonnage limits on different types of naval boats, so they couldn't get to be so big and you could only have so many of them. Now, generally speaking, many of the large nations promised but never truly reduced the size of their armaments. In addition to this, the United States loaned European nations billions of dollars, especially Germany, right after World War I, to help them rebuild. Now, the United States was also going to be selective in other ways as well. For instance, the United States joined other world powers in a commitment to world peace by signing what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the Reciprocal Tariff Act of 1934 enabled Roosevelt to liberalize American trade policy around the globe. Now, much of this was due to the fact that oil reserves in the Middle East were becoming recognized as a major source of potential wealth, and British oil companies had a large head start in the region. But Secretary of State Hughes succeeded in winning oil drilling rights for U.S. companies. In addition to this, U.S. investments in Latin America doubled between 1919 and 1929. In addition to this, the United States is going to intervene in Central American countries such as Haiti and Nicaragua to protect American interests and American trading rights within those countries as well. So generally speaking, although we stayed out of major foreign affairs and did not join the League of Nations, we did get involved in affairs around the world in various different ways, including in the Middle East, Latin America. Leading us to key idea number 2. In the 1930s, while many Americans were concerned about the rise of fascism and totalitarianism, most opposed taking military action against the aggression of Nazi Germany and Japan, until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States into World War II. Now, isolationist senators and representatives in both parties held a majority in Congress in 1938. To ensure that U.S. policy would be strictly neutral if war broke out in Europe, Congress adopted a series of Neutrality Acts, which Roosevelt signed with some reluctance. Each law applied to nations that the president proclaimed to be at war. There was 3 of them. The Neutrality Act of 1935 authorized the president to prohibit all arms shipments and to forbid U.S. citizens to travel on the ships of belligerent nations. Those are nations that are fighting each other. The Neutrality Act of 1936 forbade the extension of loans and credits to belligerents. And the Neutrality Act of 1937 forbade the shipment of arms to the opposing sides in the Civil War in Spain. In addition to this, President Roosevelt countered isolationism in the United States by gradually giving aid to the Allies, especially Great Britain, when war broke out. Now, that war had actually begun by 1938, most Americans were alarmed by news of Nazi tanks, planes, and troops conquering one country after another. They were strongly opposed to Hitler, but still hoped to keep their country out of war. President Roosevelt believed that the British survival after 1939 was critical to U.S. security. The relationship that was built over the coming years between British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt proved one of the keys to Allied success in the war. The president chipped away at the restrictive neutrality laws until practically nothing remained to prevent him from giving massive aid to Britain. After the surrender of France to the Germans in 1940, most Americans accepted the need to strengthen U.S. defenses, but giving direct aid to Britain was controversial. Now, when the war started, Congress had amended those Neutrality Acts to allow U.S. companies to sell weapons to the Allies on a cash and carry basis. Now, the British Navy still controlled the seas. Therefore, if the United States ended its arms embargo, it would only help Britain, not Germany. Roosevelt persuaded Congress in 1939 to adopt a less restrictive Neutrality Act, which provided that a belligerent could buy U.S. arms if it used its own ships and paid cash. Technically, cash and carry was neutral, but in practice, it strongly favored Great Britain. What this allowed for was to have us avoid the causes of America's entry into World War I. Remember that German unrestricted submarine warfare thing. Now, adding to the suspense over the war was uncertainty over a presidential election. Might Franklin Roosevelt be the first president to break the two-term tradition and seek re-election to the third term? Well, for months, the president gave an ambiguous reply, causing friendly speculation in the press. At last, he announced that in those critical times, he would not turn down the Democratic nomination if it were offered. Most Democrats were delighted to renominate their most effective campaigner. During the campaign, Roosevelt made the rash pronouncement, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." However, that promise would be short-lived. However, he did prepare for the possibility of entry into war and called for the first peacetime draft in U.S. history. Now, the fall of France in 1940 worried Americans that the Axis powers might win World War II. We can see the picture of Hitler right in front of the Eiffel Tower in Paris on the bottom right-hand side. And German Luftwaffe attacks on Britain meant that England needed U.S. aid more than ever. Now, Roosevelt proposed ending the cash and carry requirement of the Neutrality Acts and permitting Britain to obtain all the U.S. arms it needed on credit. The president said it would be like lending a neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire. Isolationists in the American First Committee campaigned vigorously against the Lend-Lease bill. By now, however, the majority opinion had shifted towards aiding Britain, and the Lend-Lease Act was signed into law in March of 1941. This act was used throughout World War II, and it transformed America into what Roosevelt would call the arsenal of democracy to help end the Depression in the United States. Eventually, as part of this, the United States would give nearly $5 billion in aid to Great Britain and nearly $3 billion to the USSR, and a combined nearly $3.2 billion to our other allies around the world. Now, the success of the Axis powers in Europe brought the USA closer to an undeclared war against Germany. FDR had given the Navy and merchant ships authority to attack German U-boats with a proclamation called the Shoot on Sight. In addition to this, as with the United States actively aiding Britain, Roosevelt knew that the United States might soon enter the war. He arranged for a secret meeting in August with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill aboard a ship off the coast of Newfoundland. The two leaders drew up a document known as the Atlantic Charter that affirmed that the general principles for a sound peace after the war would include self-determination for all people, no territorial expansion, and free trade. Meanwhile, through 1940 and 1941, U.S. relations with Japan were becoming increasingly strained as a result of Japan's invasion of China and ambitions to extend its conquests into Southeast Asia. Beginning in 1940, Japan was allied with Germany and Italy as one of the Axis powers. Hitler's success in Europe enabled Japanese expansion into the Dutch East Indies, British Burma, and French Indochina, territories still held as European colonies. When Japan joined the Axis in September 1940, Roosevelt responded by prohibiting the export of steel and scrap oil to all countries except Britain and the nations of the Western Hemisphere. His action was aimed at Japan, which protested that this was an unfriendly act. In July 1941, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina, today Vietnam. Roosevelt then froze all Japanese credits in the United States and also cut off Japanese access to vital materials, including U.S. oil. Both sides realized that Japan needed oil to fuel its Navy and Air Force. If the U.S. embargo on oil did not end, Japan would likely seize the oil resources in the Dutch East Indies. At the same time, Japan's invasion of China was a blatant violation of the open door policy, to which the United States was still committed. Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull insisted that Japan pull its troops out of China, which Japan refused to do. The Japanese ambassador to the United States tried to negotiate a change in U.S. policy regarding oil. An agreement, however, seemed most unlikely. In October, a new Japanese government, headed by General Hideki Tojo, made a final attempt at negotiating an agreement. Neither side, however, changed its position. The U.S. fleet in the Pacific was anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, while most Americans were still asleep in their bunks. Japanese planes from aircraft carriers flew over Pearl Harbor, bombing every ship in sight. The surprise attack lasted less than 2 hours. In that time, 2,400 Americans were killed, including over 1,100 when the battleship Arizona sank. Almost 1,200 were wounded. 20 warships were sunk or severely damaged, and approximately 150 airplanes were destroyed. In addition to Hawaii, the Japanese attacked U.S. naval bases at Guam and Wake Island. Addressing Congress on the day after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt described December 7th as a, quote, day which will live in infamy. He asked Congress to declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on December 7, 1941, a state of war had existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. On December 7th, Congress acted immediately by declaring war, with only one dissenting vote. 3 days later, Germany and Italy honored their treaty with Japan by declaring war on the United States. When America entered World War II, the U.S. had to fight a two-front war in Europe and Asia. Despite the attack by Japan, FDR viewed Germany as the immediate threat and began preparing for war. We'll talk about that war next time and the challenges the United States will face both at home and abroad, fighting the largest war to ever face our planet. What we've covered today so far is we've covered our U.S. foreign policy during the interwar years and how the United States had had a selective foreign policy, though still involved, and how our involvement in the war in Europe gradually escalated until our full involvement after Pearl Harbor. Well, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, and as always, go Pack.